Okay, I'm adding another podcast here called Taking Stock of Net Zero. This is from a report from the UK group, Oxford University, which is evaluating the race to net zero in terms of the implementation after the commitments or declarations are made or goals are announced. This is kind of an infographic from this visual capitalist website, Race to Net Zero Carbon Neutral Goals by Country. Which countries have made a carbon neutral pledge? So here you have all the countries you can see here. Wow, this is very hard to read. So China has announced 2060, which got a lot of excitement. India just announced during Glasgow COP26 that it's aiming for 2070. There is Sweden, which is argued to be the most realistic one with its 2045 target. What do we mean by realistic? It's about the immediate action plans after a net zero goal is announced. The US committed to a 2060 target. Mexico and other countries, Costa Rica is and Bhutan. Bhutan is already supposed to have met its net zero goal, and so on and so forth. So there are many countries that have not announced yet, but there are issues of what does it even mean that you announced a net zero target? There is also many companies that have announced. So in 2019, the world's 500 largest companies employed 70 million people and generated 33 trillion in revenues. Given their size and influence, many of these companies have made commitments to reduce their carbon footprint. This timeline provides a holistic view when each company expects to achieve its stated target. So there are some that are announced carbon neutrality, renewable energy, so science-based targets, whether it's 2 degrees C warming or 1.5 degrees C warming. The details are really, the devil is in the details. So this chart again very dense, but you can see there are 163 Fortune 500 companies with formal climate target, and they represent 23 countries, and they include big companies like Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Tyson Foods, Nestle must be here, Target, Walmart, Nike. You can think of whatever you can think of. BMW, Volkswagen, and so you can go around and find all your favorite companies in here, and there are targets of renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and science-based targets. So there are 42 companies from the United States, 3 from Canada, 11 from the UK, 19 from Germany, 18 from France, 13 from Japan, and the rest of the countries thrown in there as well. This should sound like good news, and it is if things stay focused and on target. This report by Black, Cullen, Fay, and so on, Taking Stock, a global assessment of net zero targets, it complements the other podcast I have on what Microsoft wrote in Nature. So in terms of timelines, we have gone from 0 to 2/3 from 2009 to 2017. So there was a key paper highlighting the eventual extent of global warming being largely determined by cumulative emissions of CO2. Because CO2 has a long residence time, it accumulates in the atmosphere, and there is essentially almost a linear relationship between accumulated carbon and global warming, which means each additional ton of CO2 is going to add to the warming. Also means people can use it to kind of say, to hit 2 degrees C warming with 67% probability, we can emit so much accumulated carbon, and we are already here. We're emitting so much per year, so we have only so many years left. So that gets a little bit hairy in terms of its implications. In 2009, Susan Solomon and other scientists showed that temperatures do not decline for many centuries even after complete cessation of CO2 emissions, which is the committed warming. Because it sticks around for so long, the equilibration takes time. But we should remember that doesn't mean that we can keep emitting. It still means that each additional ton will add to the warming, so the sooner we cut to zero, the better. Damon Matthews and other scientists propose that cumulative carbon emissions represent an alternative framework that's applicable both as a tool for climate mitigation and for the assessment of potential climate impacts. IPCC fifth assessment report that came out in 2014 states that limiting global temperature change means limiting the cumulative or stock of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. 2013 fifth assessment came out. A balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removal by sinks of greenhouse gases was the goal, so we have to achieve that under Paris Agreement. President of the World Bank, Jim Yong Kim, says in 2014 that a proposed global climate agreement should provide a clear pathway to zero net emissions before 2100. 2015 is a big year for Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions that each country submitted. So Paris Agreement is much more democratic compared to the Kyoto Protocol, which failed anyways. Sweden becomes the first nation to enshrine a mid-century net zero target at 2045 into law in 2017. IPCC releases the 1.5 degree C special report concluding that limiting temperature rise to around 1.5 degrees C and preventing the worst impact of climate change implies reaching net zero emissions of CO2 by mid-century along with deep reductions in non-CO2 emissions. Special report on 1.5 degree C came out in 2018. The UK becomes the first G7 economy to legislate for net zero by 2015-2019. Net zero pledges cover almost 1/6 of the global economy here. 2020, China, world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, commits to carbon neutrality before 2060 at the 75th UN General Assembly. Net zero pledges cover over 2/3 of, or 68%, of the global economy by 2021, and this continues to increase. So at the time of this report in early 2021, 61% of the emissions were covered, 68% of the GDPs were covered under net zero pledges, and 56% of the population was covered, including cities, states, and regions. Okay. There are some details, of course. When you say net zero, typically it refers to CO2, which gives you these kind of scenarios for 1.5, 2 degrees, and so on, in terms of where the billions of tons of CO2 per year have to begin to draw down. Technically, we are already late. This was supposed to have started in 2020 to meet the targets by these dates, but we're already at the end of 2021 and we are not really anywhere near these drawdown requirements. Okay, but additionally, non-CO2 emissions relative to 2021 will change these dates as well, because methane emissions, black carbon, and nitrous oxide emissions also have to go down to accomplish the temperature target. So when we say net zero, and they typically only refer to CO2, then there is obviously some mismatch in terms of the timelines and the requirements in terms of net CO2 equivalent drawdowns and not just net CO2 drawdowns. That's a detail that you can look up, but still the main thing is to see what the starting line criteria are for the race to net zero. The first step, of course, is the pledge at head of organizations level to reach net zero in the 2040s or sooner, or by mid-century at the latest. Plans explain what steps will be taken toward achieving net zero, especially in the short to medium term. Set an interim target to achieve over this decade. And third step is to proceed, take immediate action toward achieving net zero, consistent with delivering interim targets specified. It's not just enough to pledge, you have to go ahead with these. And finally, the publishing of reports at least annually, including via platforms that feed into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Global Action Portal. So holding people to monitoring, reporting and verifying is going to be critical. Sweden is held as an example in addition to smaller countries like Bhutan and Costa Rica. So target status already in law. Governance, there are interim targets and published plan with annual reporting already in place. Use of offsets, offsets are allowed. Conditional offsets, not allowed. Limits on offsets, yes. So what does it mean? So you can either avoid emissions by switching to renewables, energy efficiencies and so on, or you can avoidance is basically offsetting with planting trees and so on. Reducing emissions is with renewables and energy efficiency and so on. And drawdown is where you're actually doing carbon capture, utilization and sequestration. Okay, so coverage, target cases, consumption emissions not included, international aviation shipping not included. So this still means that reductions, avoidance and drawdowns are really tricky things that have to be looked at very, very, very carefully. So the analysis by this group evaluation leads to these results. Countries with net zero targets represent 28,890, 28.890 gigaton CO2 equivalent of emissions. Of these, there are some that are pledged for 2030 goal, and then there are another bunch that are pledged for 2041 to 2050, and there are few like China and India. India is not included in this evaluation, have pledged for after 2050. States and regions with net zero targets represent 497 million people. Of these, by 2030, 41 to 50, and after 2050 are shown here in terms of percentages of targets by population. Cities with net zero targets represent 639 million people. Again, most of them are in the 2040 to 2050 range. Companies with net zero targets represent 14 trillion in annual sales. There are some in 2030, most are in 2041 to 50, and there are a few in after 2050. Again, almost all corporations use offsetting as one of their way to do it, as I've explained in another podcast related to Microsoft commitments. Even if few of the energy companies use up the forests and soils for offsetting their carbon emissions, there is not going to be any room left for any other companies. So this offsetting goal is really, really not credible at this point. Net zero targets by status, so countries, states and regions. This is in populations, so emissions, populations and companies by sales. So the data is not found or proposed in discussion or aspirational in policy documents and strategies, in laws, and achieved. There is a small set of companies which claim to have achieved it. Net zero targets by coverage, again, countries, states, cities and companies. So this is by status, this is by coverage, this is use of offsets. So you can see that these offsets that are not specified, or offsetting without restrictions, offsetting with restrictions, and no offsetting have to be watched very carefully, because offsetting is imagine that you are going to emit and then you're going to offset, so you're not really reducing emissions. So companies that have that are using offsets, and they're also focusing on their supply chains, suppliers, their own energy use, travel, etc., are going to reduce emissions in some parts, not reduce emissions in other parts, and offset them. So the overall increase of emissions globally may or may not go up depending on how these things work. And there is always the problem that offsets in the biosphere and forests and soils can be reverted by wildfires, insect infestations, and so on. So this is a very, very tricky business right now. Governance indicators. So we are looking at reporting mechanisms, published plans, interim targets, and considering equity. So again, for countries, states and regions, cities and companies. I'm not going into the details of these because you can read the report that I cite. I just want to give you a flavor of the issues that exist, and this is a good evaluation of looking at the issues that are not immediately obvious when you just look at pledges to net zero with some future date. You have to always go under the hood and look at the details of what the plans are to accomplish them in the end, and what the immediate action plans are to start to get there, and what the plans are for reporting along the way. These are not very easy to understand on the face of the announcements, but obviously they are very tricky parts of the whole issue of net zero. But it's obvious that every country is now under pressure to announce a net zero, and India did announce, for example, 10 years after China. China said 2060, India says 2070, and everybody is watching whether the actions on the ground are consistent with the pledged targets. Okay.